Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Chris and Joe and Jacob and Daniel, and to Chris Mercer as well for helping us so far in the service. And it's really good that so many people can be involved in our live stream services that we've been having over the last few months. Welcome to Hope Community Church. My name is Stephen, and this morning we're going to be looking at Psalm 11. I've entitled my sermon this morning, "We've Got to Get Out of This Place." And I'd like to start by telling you a true story. And it goes back to January 1998, when two 5-month-old pigs escaped whilst being unloaded at a Wiltshire slaughterhouse. I'm doing them an injustice by calling them pigs. They were Tamworth rare breed boars, and you may remember the story. The two pigs went on the run, chased by an army of abattoir workers, police and news reporters, and of course their dramatic escape from slaughter captured the hearts of our animal-loving nation, and they became known as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Pigs. Well, in their bid for freedom, the pigs showed real determination. They squeezed under supposedly secure fencing to flee from their pursuers. They showed real stamina. They swam the River Avon. And even when they were tracked down 6 days after escaping, they continued to evade capture for another 36 hours. When they were eventually caught, it came to light that local residents who knew where the pigs were hiding out had kept quiet about their location until one of the national newspapers guaranteed to purchase the pigs and send them to an animal sanctuary. Butch and Sundance had averted a major crisis for them at the slaughterhouse, and they'd now secured a much more amenable future. And if you didn't know, that animal sanctuary was our very own Rare Breeds Sanctuary in Woodchurch. There is a postscript to this story. In 2004, the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Pigs was made into a BBC One drama called The Legend of the Tamworth 2. Now, I sense you're wondering why I've told you this story. Well, it's simply to lead us into Psalm 11, where a crisis arises in the life of King David. And there may be someone here this morning for whom this is all too close for comfort, because you too are facing a crisis in your life. So much so that you don't know what to do next. You have no idea which way to turn, and you don't think you can make it through. And how you wish that someone would come along and whisk you off and take you far away from the crisis. You're thinking, flee like a bird to your mountain. Frankly, that sounds like pretty good advice. But there is another way to deal with the crisis you're facing, and it's the way that King David takes. In the opening verse, it's almost as if David has preempted what his panic-stricken advisors have got to tell him about the situation, because he sets the agenda at the outset by affirming his own personal faith and trust. He says, "In the Lord I take refuge." And this was the very foundational truth of David's life. And the Lord wants it to be the foundational truth for every believer. But the thing is, I know in my own life that my natural default position is to try to deal with the crisis by myself. And I don't think I'll be alone in that. My prayer over this last week has been that the Lord would help each of us as Christians to apply David's expression of faith to all areas of our lives. In the Lord I take refuge. And if you don't think you're a Christian, my prayer has been that today he will open your eyes to see that he is the one sure refuge we can have, and that you will stop fleeing from him, turn around and flee to him. David, as we shall see in this psalm, doesn't panic as he faces his crisis. And I want us to take away 3 things that we can learn from him so that we can stand firm, not panic, and honour God at those times of disruption and stress in our lives. Here are the 3 headings this morning. Hands off the wheel, you're not in control. Don't evade the test, and look to see his face. So first, hands off the wheel. Well, I think it would be helpful to take a look at what's going on in the psalm. We're told it's a psalm of David, and in the psalm his advisors are saying to him, verses 1 to 3, "Flee like a bird to your mountain. For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Well, we don't really know what's going on. We don't know the historical context. David is the king, and it looks as if there has been some kind of infiltration into his administration, and his advisors have come to him to break the news. "Look," they say, "somehow your enemies have got in. They could be here in the palace right now. You're in danger. They're trying to overthrow you. You could even be assassinated. Abandon everything and go into hiding." The infiltrators are the wicked. And we came across them in Psalm 10 last week, where verse 4 says of them, "In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God." So, they're godless people. People who completely disregard God. People whose intentions are revealed in verse 2. "For look, the wicked bend their bows. They set their arrows against the strings to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart." Their intentions are destruction. Their target is the upright in heart. Or put another way, in verse 3, the righteous. These are God's people. People who have accepted God's free gift of salvation in Jesus. People who are living out their Christian faith day by day, striving to hold fast to the truth of the gospel, because they know deep within the core of their being that salvation is found in no one else. For there is no other name under heaven given to mankind by which we must be saved. So if you follow Jesus, if you're a Christian, you too are a target for the wicked. Remember how Jesus himself reminded his followers of this fact. He said, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." Why is the world like this? The answer is because there's an enemy who wants to destroy Christ and will do everything in his power to do so, including attacking his people. We know this passage of warning very well. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of sufferings. So King David, is potentially in mortal danger from the wicked. But that wasn't all. Unwittingly, his friends and advisors, the people who had his best interests at heart, were mistakenly giving bad advice. And that's one of the cunning strategies the devil uses to cause us harm. He approaches us through the advice of our friends. who are perhaps either misjudging the situation or just short-sighted in the face of things. See, David's advisors weren't being malicious. Their advice was well meant, but it was wrong advice. It was worldly advice. It was empty of the faith and trust David expressed in the opening verse, "In the Lord I take refuge." So, we've got David under mortal attack, being given the wrong advice, but there's something else going on as well in verse 3. When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? Now this is a reference to the very fabric of society that's apparently crumbling. It's one thing to face personal attacks, which are bad enough, but when there is no stability in the very fabric of society to hang on to, the question looms large. What can the righteous do? We might think like this as a small group of Christians at Hope Community Church. What can we do? What possible impact can we have in this world where moral absolutes are seen as some sort of throwback to the Victorian age, where truth is merely personal preference? Whatever you want to believe, you believe, and whatever I want to believe, I believe. When the base foundations of right and wrong, God's truths, are being dismantled, we can understand why the advisors tell David to flee like a bird to your mountain. Give up. What hope is there? Perhaps some of you remember the Animals hit single of 1965. The song was called "We Got to Get Out of This Place." And the chorus goes, I'm not going to sing it so you're safe. It says, "We've got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. We got to get out of this place because, girl, there's a better life for me and you." Where then is this better life? That's the question. And David finds it. He says, verse 4, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne." And you'll notice in this psalm, suddenly we've got a complete change of focus. David is not flummoxed. He's not without direction. He declares, the Lord is on his heavenly throne. He stops quoting what others are saying. He stops listening to their voices, and he turns to his heavenly advisor. David knows that ultimately the foundations of the world are under the heavenly throne of God. Friends, there are times when we need to get out of the presence and influence of others. People can put pressure on us without meaning to. It can come through friends or family, perhaps even through something we're reading or watching. We need to get alone in the presence of God, because there we can be sure to find the way through our problem or crisis. So find a room, shut the door, and speak to God in secret. He promises to meet us by his Spirit and through his word. And yes, we can become overwhelmed by the reality of this world, our lives, our issues, and there's someone who delights in us being so distracted, the devil. But the great and genuine reality is that God is on his throne. God has a plan. God is governing and ruling. It's always been like that, and it always will be. And what's more, However out of control our personal circumstances or society in general may appear, we can come to God by faith and find help in our troubles and comfort for our soul that is more real and more enduring than anything else. You know, when my two brothers and me were children, we had toy steering wheels which attached to the backrest of the front seats of Mum or Dad's car, so that when they were driving the car, we too could drive from the back seats, and we would think we were driving the car, although of course we weren't. But most probably we were just making a nuisance of ourselves in the back seats. And people are pretty much like us with our toy steering wheel. We think we're in control. We think the reason why the world is moving forward is because we are in charge. We're doing a good job. We're doing it right. And what instead happens is when it gets out of control, which inevitably it does during times of crisis, just like the one we're going through now, then we feel it's out of control. And David says, no, God is on the throne. There is a well-known Bible verse, isn't there, which says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." God always has a plan, and that plan is going to work no matter what. It will work for his own glory and for our benefit. That's what it says in the Bible. So, if we think about the strategy of the wicked here in verse 2, the picture we have is surely most vividly illustrated near the end of the Gospels, when the chief priests and the Pharisees bend their bows. They go to Judas Iscariot, don't they? And they say, "Hey Judas, 30 pieces of silver. All you've got to do is kiss him, and then we'll get him." They set their arrows against the strings. They go around the crowd and they say, "Hey you, we don't know if you saw anything or not. We just need a few false witnesses. We're going to shoot from the shadows at the upright in heart." And if you were one of the disciples, everything would have looked like it was falling apart. You believed Jesus was the Messiah and he was going to put everything right. You've seen him heal people, raise the dead. He was going to solve all our problems. But then you watch him being crucified and not doing anything to stop it. And as you watch him die, your world falls apart, and it makes absolutely no sense at all. The wicked have bent the bow and shot the Messiah from the shadows, and it looks like everything is out of control. And you can just imagine people watching Jesus being crucified and then going home and saying, "I don't see how God could bring anything good out of this." And perhaps they lost their faith watching the greatest thing that God ever did for the salvation of the world. It was the most terrible thing, but it worked out for good. And the fact is that every situation is like that. Whilst we have the Bible to explain why that horrible tragedy happened, we do not have books to explain why a particular pandemic happens, or a war happens, or that personal crisis that has hit us. We don't know. But what we do know is God is on his throne. So David in verse 4 declares that the Lord is ruling the world, and when it seems to be out of control, it's not out of control. Don't evade the test. Well, speaking of tests, this summer, university students sat their exams online. It was a completely sort of new way of dealing with exams. Not sitting quietly for a couple of hours in a great big sports hall. Everything was done at home on the computer. And as you know, we're involved in student accommodation, and I've been told by a number of students that they had 24 hours, 36 hours, or even 48 hours to complete those exams. And they were allowed to refer to books and look up things online. And I thought, gosh, how things have changed. How I wish I could have sat my previous school and other exams in that way. And the verse 4 in this psalm tells us that the Lord is the examining Lord. It reads, "The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He observes everyone on earth. His eyes examine them." So the Lord is not only ruling the world, but he observes everyone on earth. He knows each one of us as intimately as if there was no other person in the whole universe. That's how well he knows you. And the amazing truth of Psalm 139, that we were intricately wrought in our mother's womb and so on, is to bring comfort and strength and encouragement to believers to know that in times of difficulty, discouragement or crisis, when our best intentions are misunderstood, the fact of the matter is that God knows the truth, for he is the observing Lord. He is the examining Lord. His eyes examine them. And verse 5, the Lord examines the righteous. And examine here is like the job of the metalsmith who purifies gold or silver. The Lord tests his people to discover the truth. That's the picture we've got here. As God's children, none of us should hope to gain heaven without tests and trials. God wants difficulty in a Christian life. He wants it that way. Because if you think about it, how do you build up body muscle? I don't know why I'm pointing to myself, by the way. You build up body muscle by using it. So how do you develop spiritual muscle? By having to put some strain upon it. And that's what God desires for every Christian. See, if we run from trials, we miss his blessing. You see, our capacity, our ability to say, "In the Lord I take refuge," has to be rooted in our life experience. If someone asks you, what does it mean to take refuge in the Lord? You and I must be able to answer. We should be able to point to occasions when we said, on that particular day, when I stood firm to face that calamity, when my friend said, "Get out of here, flee," the Lord gave me courage and strength to come through. And because of that day, because of those times, I can now face this. You know those posters and things like fridge magnets with motivational slogans, phrases that are meant to inspire you and psych up you for the day ahead, like "Believe you can and you're halfway there," or "You did not wake up to be mediocre." Building spiritual muscle is not about reading those things on your way out of the house in the morning. It's not for a moment. Real spiritual muscle is not rhetoric. It is the conviction that comes from faith. Remember when David fought Goliath? When the armies of Israel faced the Philistine armies who had this giant of a man called Goliath on his side. I think some accounts said he was 11 foot tall, or, that's what we've sort of gleaned. And for 40 days and nights, in the morning and in the evening, he walked out from the ranks of the Philistines and tormented the armies of Israel. Why don't you send someone out here to fight me? And for 40 days and 40 nights, the soldiers in the armies of Israel looked at one another as if to say, well, you go, but I'm not going. And they went back to bed, so to speak. So Goliath went back to his camp, waiting for the next day to dawn. And into this stalemate comes David. Not King David at this stage, but shepherd boy David, sent by his dad to deliver provisions to his brothers who were serving in the army and to say hello to them. And to cut a long story short, David goes to the king and drops this bombshell on him when he says, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." And the king, who was Saul, who surely could not believe his ears, replies, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a young man. He has been a warrior from his youth." The point I'm trying to get to is what happens next. David, in a sense, puts his money where his mouth is. He applies the foundational truth, "In the Lord I take refuge," and he foresees his ability to confront Goliath because God has been his refuge in confronting previous challenges. And so he tells Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." Now we see the foundational truth of verse 1, "In the Lord I take refuge," played out in action. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of Philistine. And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And when he did, and he faced Goliath, and Goliath looked him in the face and said, "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." How would you have felt? Would you have been scared? Was David scared? He was scared. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is facing fear and overcoming it. It's when you're scared and you keep going. And as the story goes on, what does David do? He continues to apply verse 1 to the situation. "In the Lord I take refuge." And he says to Goliath, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcass of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel." David trusted God when he fought off the wild animals, and so he could trust God as he fought Goliath. And because God has been his refuge in those challenges, he can confront the crisis he faces in Psalm 11. God examines and tries the righteous with a view to their well-being. In contrast, look at verse 5b. "But the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion." After those quite dreadful scenes, disturbing scenes, I think in the capital of violence towards the police and the wanton damage to cars and buildings and statues during the early Black Lives Matter protests, our Home Secretary announced that the perpetrators would be brought to justice. Now, most of them were wearing face masks, so you think, how's that going to happen? But we know from previous scenes of looting and violence that eventually, through meticulous police investigation work, the perpetrators are found and brought to justice. And often those perpetrators can turn out to be the most unlikely characters. Here, the Lord examines the righteous, but the wicked, those who love violence, he hates with a passion. On the wicked he will rain fiery coals and burning sulphur. A scorching wind will be their lot. This is a picture of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember what happened to Sodom as it lived in rebellion against God? Finally, having given it opportunity after opportunity, God came in judgment on Sodom. And in Genesis we read these words, "Then the Lord rained down burning sulphur on Sodom and Gomorrah." God is holy. He hates sin. We don't often hear about God hating with a passion. We of course mostly hear about God's love. But God cannot tolerate the presence of sin. And when Jesus speaks about his own return, he speaks about it in those exact terms. Listen to what he says in Luke's Gospel. "It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulphur rained down from heaven and destroyed them all." God is not like a frail father who may at one time be angry and the next time be happy, but rather God's whole nature is set against sin. It is because of what God is that it is impossible for the righteous and the wicked to end up in the same place. God is righteous and he loves justice. And now we move to the final point, seek his face. And a few weeks ago, it was one blustery Saturday morning, Sarah and I found ourselves in W.H. Smith's in Tenterden. Now, like good citizens, we were both wearing face masks. Mine was quite a black one. And lo and behold, also in W.H. Smith's were Peter and Linda. And Linda was her usual smiling self, but Peter seemed unsure. We thought he seemed a little bit off with us. And we could tell because neither of them were being good citizens and wearing their face masks. So we could see them. There, I've said it. So after we had got home, we contacted Peter later to check he was okay. And he explained how he found our encounter in W.H. Smith's quite surreal because he could not see our faces. He couldn't see our expressions to judge our mood and our demeanour. He felt no proper connection with us. He could not see our faces properly. Well, in the Bible, when it talks about seeking God's face, it doesn't just mean to pray. It means at least to pray, but it means something much more than that. It means fellowship with him. It means intimacy with him. It means coming into his presence. It means sensing his love and his reality on your life. David declares, the Lord is in his holy temple. And in Psalm 27, David says, One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, and gaze on the beauty of the Lord, and to seek him in his temple. And in David's day, you could go to the temple, but only the high priest could go back to the Holy of Holies and be in the presence of God. And that was once a year, because of the sins of the people created a barrier between God and the people. So you might want to see God's face, you might want that close fellowship, but it wasn't really that accessible. But when Jesus appears, when he goes to the temple and casts out the money changers, and they say, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" And Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." Jesus was talking about his body, not the temple. And when he died, the veil of the temple, the actual temple, that barrier between God and humanity, was ripped in two. So what's the significance of this? Well, Jesus is saying, I'm the bridge. I'm the temple. I'm the bridge between God and man. I'm the high priest. It's my blood that has opened the way, and now you can come right into the presence of God. I've broken through that concrete slab that sin had created between you and God, and now through me you really can see his face. You can know him. You can sense his presence. So go. The Lord is righteous. He loves justice. The upright will see his face. It's a wonderful promise. The upright will see his face. What could be greater than having fellowship with God? You can have fellowship with God, and that's what he wants from you. That's what he promises to give you. Why would you go anywhere else? Why would you flee to your mountain? Jesus once asked his 12 disciples the same question. He said, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" And Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." What could be greater than having fellowship with God?